Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their timeless and extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. Each episode is a testimonial of the recovery available to all who want it in Alcoholics Anonymous. My guest on this episode is Mike B., a man with whom I've attended Sunday evening men's AA meetings with since he first got sober over 30 years ago. Mike's story is a classic tale of a life brought to the brink of ruin by alcoholism. Brought up in a mostly normal home, his introduction to booze was similar to many of us alcoholics who started drinking in our teens. Mike liked the effects produced by alcohol and continued to drink through 6 years in the Navy and for years after. Negative consequences, including 2 failed marriages, piled up around Mike's drinking. He started losing everything until he literally had nothing more than the clothes on his back. On the street and barely subsisting, Mike fell to his knees at a bus stop and asked God for help. That was his moment of clarity and the turning point in his otherwise wretched life. Mike sought out treatment at the VA hospital and sober living arrangements, which tethered him to an AA program that was his last hope for survival. But it worked. Mike finally resigned from the debating society and followed his sponsor's blueprint for recovery, set forth in late December 1994. He has been sober ever since. Mike's journey of sober life is not dissimilar to many long-term recovered alcoholics in AA. He continues to do all that the program suggests and has been of continuous service to his fellows. His third marriage to a woman in Alcoholics Anonymous is a long-term and cherished gift in both their lives, made possible by active participation in AA. I believe you'll be both inspired and enriched by my interview with Mike. He and I have been close for a very long time, and his authenticity as a loyal member of Alcoholics Anonymous comes through every time he shares. So please, sit back and enjoy the next hour and 10 minutes of AA Recovery Interviews with my good friend and AA brother, Mike V.
I'm Mike, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Mike. That's what I say in return. AA is one of the few places where you can get a whole room full of people to say hi to you when you say hi.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thanks so much for doing the AA Recovery Interviews podcast with me this evening. What's really cool is that you and I have been going to the same meeting in Houston on a Sunday evening for you're sober now, what,
30 years.
30 years, and your anniversary is?
December 30th, 1994.
So for 30 years, since you first came in, you started coming to this meeting.
I was about 6 months sober when Jim brought me to this meeting.
Yeah, Jim is a good man. But what's interesting about it is you're a meeting maker when it comes to this meeting and other meetings that you go to, as am I. So I believe that you and I have sat in the same meeting on Sunday evenings for 30 years, which means that we probably shared meeting at least 1,500 times.
Yeah, probably.
But I've gotten to know your story little bits and pieces at a time, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there in a meeting. So this is a real treat for me to be able to sit down with you and talk to you about what I believe has been a very colorful life. And you mentioned earlier that you just retired.
Yeah.
What's it been like?
It's been a challenge, just not having some place where I had to be.
Yeah.
Or anybody that needed me to be there. Because of the type of job I had, there were people that couldn't go home until I showed up. So it's kind of different, not having people dependent on me, other than my wife.
Well, and the guys who you see in meetings, I was glad to hear you say that now that you're retired, you can go to more meetings.
And I am. I'm going to a lot more meetings. I'm going to 6 meetings a week. I give my wife 1 night a week that I don't go to a meeting.
Oh, that's good. And she goes to meetings too, right?
Oh, yeah.
How long has she been sober?
33 years.
So she precedes you by 3 years?
Mm-hmm. It's funny. We'd been married about a year, and I asked her, I said, how would you like to go to midnight mass at the Vatican? She goes, are you kidding me? And I said, no. I said, let's take a trip to Italy for Christmas.
Uh-huh.
So we went to Italy, and while we were roaming around, we met this couple that turned out we were both going to be in Venice for New Year's. We made arrangements to meet. We gave them the hotel that we were going to be in, told them, make arrangements for New Year's Eve, and we'll pay for it. And Just give us a call and we'll meet you. Of course, my birthday being December 30th, I was just getting ready to celebrate 8 years of sobriety. And I told Olga, I said, now, at midnight, they're going to bring champagne, and we'll just push our champagne across the table to the other couple. And I'll explain to them that I said, you don't need to violate your anonymity. I said, but I'll explain that I'm just celebrating my 8th year of sobriety. And that moment came, and as we were pushing our champagne across the table, they were pushing theirs across to us. Turned out he'd been sober for 30 years, and she was a Mormon.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it was so funny.
It always amazes me that people I run into who are members of the program, it's always kind of a warm feeling wherever I am to know that there's another alcoholic in my line of sight or in the same room or sitting next to me or around me in a meeting. We meet all types, don't we?
We just had it happen yesterday morning. We went for breakfast, and Mark was there with a group that he apparently went to a meeting with, and they had gone out to breakfast afterwards, and he came over to our table, so I got to introduce my wife to Mark, and he goes, I really love your husband. She goes, I really do too.
That's wonderful. Well, the cool thing is that you're both in recovery. There's a certain language that we speak in AA. There's certain things that we can't necessarily take for granted, but we can be pretty sure are a certain way. Your story, I've heard different pieces of it over the years, but I know that you came into the program in a lot of despair, and you were destitute at the time. Could you tell me a little bit about that time in your life?
Actually, it starts in the early 1980s, and my parents had flown to Ohio to meet my fiance, and then turned around and told me not to marry her. She and I had first met sitting around a pool drinking beer. And so alcohol was involved in everything she and I did together. And she had told me when we first met on our first meeting, she said, I want kids, but I don't want a husband.
Oh.
Yeah. Stupid me. I wasn't listening. And I went ahead and married her anyways, even though my parents told me not to. And my parents, after that meeting, had flown back to Houston. They had moved here recently. It was about 2 o'clock the next morning. My father called me and said, come and get me at the airport. And I said, Dad, Houston is 1,400 miles from here. He goes, no, I'm back in Columbus. I need you to come and get me and take me out to the house, because they still owned a home up there. So we sat all night and talked. I picked him up. It was like maybe the thing he wanted to tell me, the main thing, was that he didn't ever want any extraordinary measures taken to keep him alive, because he'd had open heart surgery years before. He was only 59. And the other thing he wanted to tell me is why we grew up in a dry household. He said, both your grandfathers, both my father and your mother's father, were alcoholics. And he goes, we decided early in our marriage that we weren't going to have alcohol in the house because we were afraid that there might be some connection, that there might be some family ailment, because they could trace it back a long ways. We had a bottle of Canadian Club underneath the kitchen sink way in the back, and I had a shot glass in that cabinet above the stove that you got to get a ladder to get to. Yeah. And every New Year's Eve, they would each get a glass of 7-Up, and they would measure out very carefully a shot of Canadian Club and throw it in there, and then put the bottle back. And that was all the alcohol they would have for the year.
Wow. So that, as a kid, that's all you saw?
That's all I saw from my parents. Now my friends, their families had beer in the refrigerator and bars in the house and everything, so I had exposure to it.
Your family of origin, how would you describe growing up as a child in your family?
Driven. My parents both came from very poor backgrounds. When I looked on Ancestry, they were termed subsistence farmers. He lived in the last company town in the whole country, a place called Haydenville, Ohio. Had a brick factory there. And they grew up very poor. And my mother was from Houma, Louisiana, and her father was a sheriff's deputy. And her mother died very young. and she ended up being raised by an aunt, actually by a sister-in-law. My mother worked in the 60s, which was uncommon in my neighborhood. Most mothers were at home.
You're talking about a typical suburban neighborhood in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah. My dad worked at Rockwell Aerospace, and he was an inspector. When I look back now, he didn't make very much money. You know, they bought a house in the 50s for $5,000, and pretty typical. I never wanted for anything. But a funny thing about that night that my dad and I sat and talked, he told me he thought I was an alcoholic. But he said, for some reason, I think you're going to be okay. It was another 13 or 14 years of drinking before I got sober.
That's the old "it takes what it takes."
Yeah.
How many siblings you got?
I have a sister. I had a sister that was 5 years older than me. She died of COVID a couple of years ago. And then I've got a brother that's 13 years younger than me.
So did you know him very much when he was growing up?
When I went in the Navy, he was just getting to school age. I was 13. He was about 4 or 5, you know. I guess, yeah, I was a built-in babysitter. And, you know, when I started having kids, I already knew how to do the cloth diaper deal and all that stuff because I had to do it with him.
So how would you rate your childhood now that you've listened to so many people in so many meetings talk about theirs?
I had a wonderful childhood. Of course, you know, my mother was a rager in a lot of ways, you know, and I think she kind of overpowered my dad a lot of the times. And, you know, he gave in. I can't ever remember my father raising his voice. Now, my father was the dealer of corporal punishment up until the point I was about 10 years old, and I said, that's it. No more spankings. My sister was about to get one, and he had a yardstick, and it had a special place in a special closet, and I took it and broke it up into little pieces and threw it in the hedge. And I said, we're not taking beatings anymore. And that was the end of it.
That was it?
That was it. Yeah, I was stunned. At his funeral, some of his friends came up and talked to me about it because they said it was really an eye-opening time for all of them.
That's amazing that one gesture as a child changed the dynamic there in your home.
Yeah, I was amazed that his friends, that he shared that with his friends, that, yeah, my son broke up the yardstick and threw it in the hedges and said, that's it. We're not doing this anymore.
That's a great family story.
Yeah.
Now, when did you take your first drink?
My very first drink was about 7 years old, maybe 8. My parents took us to New Orleans to visit with some family down there. We very rarely visited family outside of the little place where we lived in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And we had gone down there. Of course, my grandmother was dead. My grandfather was quite old at the time. And my grandfather gave me a drink of beer, and my mother got livid about it. And it's really the only time I remember seeing him until his funeral a couple years later, when he passed away. And I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. We had gone down for his funeral, and it was all, you know, kind of crazy for me. And years later, the woman that had ended up raising my mom, her brother's wife, I saw that she was having an 80th birthday in Metairie. So I told my wife, I said, let's go. So we showed up, and it was at a VFW hall, and we walked in, and nobody knew who we were. They thought we were crashing their party. And they were like, who are you? I said, oh, I'm Mike Katie's son. No, you're not. I said, yeah. And they were like, oh my gosh, we haven't seen you since you were like, and I said, yeah, I remember. They said, you can't remember that. And I said, there was a drawbridge right outside the funeral home. And I went out there and watched it. And they said, oh my God, you do remember. And everybody was leaving one at a time. And they were coming back with these little pictures of me in my pressed white shirt and red bow tie from the parochial school I was going to at the time. It was funny. But then we made it an annual pilgrimage for a while, going to Metairie on Easter and taking my aunt and taking her to Mass and going out to a nice dinner afterwards. I remember a cousin asking me on one of those trips, he says, "Why are you coming out here? Why are you doing this?" At the time, I'd been sober for a while. And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to be a little better nephew than I was a son."
When it comes to drinking on your own volition, how old were you then?
13. I remember it distinctly because there was a junior high dance, and there was a little girl that liked me, and I knew I was going to have to dance with her, and I didn't know how to dance. And a friend of mine had been stealing liquor out of his parents' liquor cabinet and putting it in a ball jar, mixing it all together, wine, whiskey, vodka. Tasted terrible. But we sat under a bridge and drank that on the way to that thing. I had a great time at that dance. That girl ended up being my first girlfriend. And my sister found me laying in the front yard in my own puke at like 12 o'clock or 12:30. She was coming home from a date, and she found me laying in the yard and managed to get me in the house and get me cleaned up and put me to bed, and didn't say anything to my parents. That was kind of the history of my drinking. There were people that could have said things to my parents as I was growing up about my drinking and using, and never did.
So they were oblivious to it?
My parents were totally oblivious to it.
So you never had to suffer the consequences, except the fear that maybe they would find out, I guess, huh?
Well, they took me to a psychiatrist one time. They had decided on New Year's Eve to go to my uncle's house in Louisville, Kentucky, down around Fort Knox. And I had decided, well, I'm going to invite a few friends over to the house for New Year's Eve party. So I called a couple friends and said, "Yeah, why don't you come on over? My parents are out of town for the weekend." And 200 people showed up.
Oh, gee.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in a court.
Like a cul-de-sac, yeah.
Yeah, of course, everybody had to try and park in my driveway. And they were parked all over the place. Music blaring. I thought, oh, God, I'm going to get killed for this. I had a terrible time because I spent the whole night trying to keep my parents' house from getting burned down. And the next day, there were some girls from my class that came over and helped clean up the house. And when my parents came home, my mother noticed that the couch was pushed all the way up to the wall. And that's what clued her into something had gone on while they were gone. And she found an empty box of condoms under my bed. Wasn't mine. I didn't get laid that night. And so they took me to a psychiatrist.
Just based on that?
Mm-hmm. I would imagine they probably, had gotten some other word from other places. But
How old were you at that time?
16. After that party, there was a girl that had given me a Quaalude, and I had never done a Quaalude before. And I took that thing and went to school thinking, oh, this won't be anything. It's just a pill. And I passed out. Matter of fact, I fell out. They sent me to the principal's office, and the principal called the police. And the police came, and this police patrolman threw a nickel, dime, and a quarter and a penny on the floor. And he said, "Pick them up from smallest to largest." And when I bent over, I kept going. And I passed dead out. Woke up in the dentist office where my mom worked at. And they were showing me a PDR, physician's desk reference,
Right.
trying to figure out what I took.
Did they find out?
Yeah, I was able to identify what I took, but I didn't tell them where I'd gotten it from, But I think it was probably that, coupled with the condom box, that got me in a psychiatrist's office.
This is all happening up in Ohio?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned that you started drinking heavily. When did that change occur?
Junior in high school, I discovered that I was able to buy beer. I got a fake driver's license. I had the girl that I had been with at that junior high school dance, I was still seeing her, and she was working in a pharmacy. At the time, driver's licenses were paper, and they were easily forged, and she got me some blank driver's licenses because in the pharmacy she worked at, they sold driver's licenses. And you could go in there and get a driver's license if you had all the proper paperwork and everything. But she got me a blank one, and I made it out to be a that I was 21, and I started going into liquor stores. And of course, in Ohio, you couldn't buy hard liquor. You couldn't buy whiskey or anything like that. That was sold in a state store. But you could buy beer and wine in a regular store. Funny, I drank for years before I turned 18. And when I turned 18, I thought I was being slick. And there was a bar called the Poorhouse on Main Street. And I'd been drinking there I was already drinking liquor in there. And I went in thinking I was going to be smart. And I threw my driver's license on the bar and wanted my free beer for turning 18. And they kicked me out of the bar. I was like, oh, well, that was a stupid thing to do. I've been drinking here for years. But yeah, as a matter of fact, by the time I graduated from high school, there were people that wouldn't drink with me anymore.
Why not?
I would drink too much, and I would do stupid stuff, really stupid stuff. And they just didn't want to be associated. They didn't want to be arrested.
So were you drinking really for the effect that it was giving you for interaction with other people, or were you drinking for other reasons in addition?
I think initially when I started drinking to get drunk, I was drinking because I liked the effect that I got for that short period of time before I got out of control. For that one sweet spot. You're trying to hit that sweet spot, and I never could. I'd always go beyond, trying to get to that spot where I was smart and handsome and funny.
So unlike a lot of people who go through miserable childhoods and have difficulties in school and with relationships, who end up drinking to either fit in or to obfuscate their disappointments in life or whatever else. You had a happy childhood, but you started drinking for the effect of it to fit in, or what?
Well, I started drinking because friends were drinking, and they said, oh, you need to try this. And when I tried it, I was like, hey, that's a pretty nice feeling. Now, you got to remember that this was in the late 60s. This was right around that time, was like 1969, 1970, 71. I graduated in 72. And it was right around the time when I found marijuana. And it was, of course, in Ohio, it wasn't as readily available as it was someplace like Florida or Texas or California. So it was kind of hard to come by. And actually, that's how I ended up in the military, was I got arrested for marijuana back when it was a big crime to get arrested for marijuana.
You got arrested for possession?
Yeah, yeah.
How did that unfold?
A friend of mine and I went and picked up an ounce of pot, and we were getting ready to go to Myrtle Beach for spring break. It was our senior year in high school. Apparently, the police must have had the place staked out, because when we pulled up to a four-way stop, and there was a cop behind us, and there was a cop at each of the other three stop signs. And the guy I was with had come over on the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. His name was Lewis. So I took the fall for it because, I couldn't put his immigration status at risk. I'm sure he had repercussions from his family, but I took the fall for that when I went to court for it. It was a time when the Vietnam War was coming to an end. I mean, it ended in 75, but because of all the protests and everything, nobody was going in the military. So they said, if you go in the military, we'll take this off your record. So that's what I did. I went in the Navy for 6 years.
What was that experience like?
The Navy?
Yeah.
It was one big party.
Really?
Yeah. I was stationed aboard a cryptographic ship. A spy ship, basically. They had had some issues with some ships during the Korean War, during the Israeli Six-Day War. And they said, that ain't going to happen no more. So they put NSA people aboard a guided missile cruiser, and they would load a Quonset hut, basically. It was a like a shipping container
Mm-hmm.
full of listening devices. And we would go around the world. And I was an engineer, so I don't know a whole lot about how that stuff worked, but I had a close friend that was a cryptographer. He would give me little bits and pieces about what they would do. But we were gone a lot.
So you were out to sea an awful lot.
An awful lot. But we went a lot of pretty cool places. And I initially went in nuclear propulsion engineering and quickly discovered that I didn't have the brain for that. The trigonometry, the physics, and everything that was involved. So I ended up transferring over to what they called conventional, which was boilers and steam engines.
So from the consequence of you getting stopped and arrested came this experience in the Navy that turned out to be really good for you?
Oh, exactly. I had to come home one time I needed a base sticker for my car. And they said, well, you need to have driver's ed. Either go take a driver's ed course or go back to your high school and get some certification. So I went back and I went to my high school and walked in the office, and I hadn't been there in a couple of years. And I didn't think anybody knew anything about me or what I'd been doing. And I walked in, and the principal came out as the guy that was principal when I was there, Mr. Endry. I remember his name. And he just went crazy. Oh, Mike, we're so glad to see you back. We read about you all the time in the paper. I said, what? He says, yeah. He goes, we get these little snippets back in there. They had this newspaper, the Reynoldsburger Reporter. It was a small town.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, yeah, they're talking about you going to Turkey and going to the Black Sea and going here and there. And we're all kind of living vicariously through you. It must be really amazing. And I said, well, yeah, it is kind of fun, you know. I wanted to be an attorney when I got out of school. Well, that's just what we needed, was one more attorney.
Did you go to college on the GI Bill or anything like that?
I was in the last group of 18-year-olds that would get 4 years of free college, and I didn't use it. I ended up really liking what I learned to do in the Navy, working in power plants, working with steam equipment. So that's what I ended up doing pretty much the rest of my life. That's how I ended up, ultimately working for Baylor for 23 years, working in a power plant.
It's amazing that this part of your story, that the consequences of having gotten caught and the other things that were going on became a pivotal part of your life for your career, but the drinking never subsided?
No, and there were DUIs scattered in there. There were plenty of consequences, so to speak, but, it's like it was just part of the deal. If you're going to drink and drive, you're going to get caught every once in a while. I can't tell you how many thousands of times I did drink and drive and didn't get caught, as well as just about everybody that was in this room tonight, I'm sure.
So you move on after the Navy. How much time is there between the end of the Navy and when you got married?
Okay, I got married at 18. I've been married 3 times. I got married 3 days after I turned 18, before I went in the Navy, to a girl my parents didn't like either. Went in the Navy, went to boot camp, was married when I went to boot camp, got back from boot camp, gathered her up, and we went up to Great Lakes, Illinois, and went to A school, went to my first training. Came back, took her back to her parents, and then I went on my first deployment. While on that first deployment, she got pregnant by somebody else. Yeah, I was catatonic. I was so upset. And now I look back at it and I said, gosh, you married a girl that was a, party animal just like you were.
Yeah.
And, she was like 6 months older than me. I said, her hormones are in the same place yours are. What would you have been doing if she left you for 6 months? At the time, and for years later, I couldn't let go of that. I couldn't see that. I couldn't see what kind of position I had put her in.
Did she get together with the guy with whom she had that baby?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she did. I ran into her years later. After I was married again, 18, we were divorced by the time I was 19. I got married again at 28. And I ran into her in a grocery store.
You're talking about your first wife.
The first one. I ran into her in a grocery store, and she had the child with her and the guy that had gotten her pregnant.
Did you attempt to see the baby after she had it?
No. I had told her at the time, I said, because at the time we were getting what they called BAQ, that was basic housing allowance.
Mm-hmm.
And that was going to her by check every month. I was writing to her. I was trying to call. I wasn't getting any communication from her. Of course, she was pregnant, by somebody else. So she didn't want to talk to me. And I didn't know about it yet. So when I found out, it wasn't until I got back from that deployment, went home, and she's 5 months pregnant. It's obviously not my kid because I'd been gone for 7 months. I told her, I said, if you don't fight this divorce, I won't drag you through the mud. I'll just say we couldn't get along and that, we just want a divorce. And so then I had the basic housing allowance set to my paycheck instead of her. Because the first thing she said to me when I showed up was, "Where's the money? What happened to the money?" I said, "Well, you weren't responding to any of my correspondence. I cut off the money because thought maybe I could shake something out of you." But not even that did it. So what I did was I kept getting that housing allowance for a while until I could pay for the attorney that got us the divorce. But, it was a terrible time in my life. I mean, I broke out in hives and I had physical issues related to that due to anxiety over the whole thing.
Did you ramp up your consumption as a result?
Oh, yeah, the whole time. As a matter of fact, when I came home that time and discovered her pregnant, I think I grabbed a couple record albums because she said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, just give me my record albums." And I took those and threw them in my car, drove to my parents' house, opened their garage door, grabbed my camping gear out of their garage, and my dad said he was able to get out the front door just in time to see the tailgate of my car going around the corner. They freaked out. They didn't know she was pregnant. They didn't have any communication with her because they didn't like her. Well, finally, my mother called her mother and said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Well, Patty's pregnant, and it's not Mike's kid." And my mother just freaked because my parents thought I was going to go kill myself or something. Certainly, if it was my child, that's the first thing that would have, self-harm would have been the first thing that would have come to mind.
Now, this is the girl who they originally didn't like, and
Yeah.
they came into town.
Oh, no, that was almost 10 years later.
Oh, that's okay.
They didn't like the second one either.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, my picker was pretty screwed up.
So after that first marriage, there's a 10-year period.
Yeah, I was 28 by the time I got married the second time. And now my mother did show up at that wedding. My father had passed away. As a matter of fact, after that meeting where my dad had flown back to Columbus, Ohio and called me, and I came and picked him up at the airport, and we talked all night, the very next day he died. After he told me he thought I was an alcoholic, but he thought I was going to be okay. The very next day, he passed away. My sister was living up there at the time, and she had a master's in nursing, and my brother-in-law was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And they were worried about his mental state and had called the only doctor they knew, which was his cardiologist, had done open heart surgery on him 15 years before. Yeah. Uh-huh. And so they put him in the hospital overnight. And the hospital had called me and said, "Hey, your dad's here." And I got on the phone with him. I said, "You want me to go to the house and get you some pajamas or underwear or anything like that?" Because they still had stuff up there. Yeah. He says, "No, I'm fine. I'm set up." He goes, "I'll call you when I want to come home." He goes, "They just want to keep me for observation overnight." And then during the night that night, he had vomited in his sleep and aspirated it into his lungs. No. And I got a call from the nurse's station at like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and said, "Get down here to the hospital right now and don't have a wreck." I said, "I'm on my way." Yeah. And came down, and my brother-in-law handed me a lab coat as I got off the elevator on the floor where they said he was at. And he said, "Just follow me and don't say anything."
Yeah.
Put this on, follow me, don't say anything. And we went in the room, and they were doing a code on him, you know. They were trying to bring him back. And I turned to my brother-in-law, and I said, how long has he been like this? He goes, well, we'd been here 20 minutes. I said, what are the chances of him ever getting out of that bed? He goes, oh, him. I said, we just had this conversation last night. He didn't want this. And to those people's credit, they stopped right then. I said that. They backed off and called it right then. And we bathed him, and I hung out with my mother had somehow managed to get up there. She worked for a medical insurance company down here, and I think she took a private plane and flew up there. But she and I spent the next couple days together getting things, paperwork and everything straightened around.
What an amazing course of events that happened.
Yeah, for him to tell me, you know, and this is thinking about it years later, for him to tell me, I think you're an alcoholic.
What was your response to him when he said that to you?
I don't think I said anything. I think I just looked at him. Because he was giving me, at the same time, he was telling me about the history of alcoholism in our family that we had never been exposed to, but it was just not talked about.
Not talked about. So I'm trying to figure out the chronology here. Your dad passes away, and how old were you when that happened?
28.
You were 28. There's the time between the Navy and 28, where you're drinking. What did your drinking look like? Was it escalating from that point on?
You know, it was spree drinking because, of course, we were out at sea a lot. And, you know, the times when we were out to sea, if I had a chance to bring drugs with me, I would. So, you know, there were times when I did have booze on board the ship. But it's not like you could overindulge.
But once you got into any port,
oh yeah,
then all bets were off.
It was on then. You could go do anything you wanted to. There was one time in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, I got so drunk that I wandered away from the base proper. That place is a military base, and at the time it was surrounded by minefields. And I'm walking down this gravel road, and there were just little chains that had these little triangular signs on them that said danger minefield. And I'm on the road. I mean, I'm not out in the minefield, but of course security picked me up and took me and threw me in a dirt floored cell overnight and took me back to the ship the next day. Nothing was ever said about it.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying my AA Recovery Interviews podcast, check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first printing of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing and meaningful way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, Amazon, or iTunes. While you're there, enhance your program with another audiobook I produced, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. Listen to a free sample of Lost Stories of the Big Book on Audible, Amazon, or iTunes. It's also available as a Kindle book or in paperback from Amazon if you'd like to read along. You're gonna love it. And we're back. So you never had any consequences while you were in the Navy from the drinking?
From the drinking, no. From the drugs, yes. As a matter of fact, I ended up getting out of the Navy 5 months early as a result of the drugs because I'd been busted twice. They sent me to what was called the NDRC, the Naval Drug Rehabilitation Center in Jacksonville, Florida, for about 6 weeks one time. And usually when people went there, they were released. They were given a general under honorable discharge, or depending on what they'd done, they'd get a discharge from there. I ended up going to another ship because of what my background was in mechanical. And then I was really good at my job.
So you dodged that bullet as well.
I dodged that bullet as well. As a matter of fact, I left the NDRC and I dropped a guy off in Atlanta, Georgia, and got arrested and ended up in jail in Macon, Georgia. The Navy had to come and get me out of jail. I got thrown in jail because the cop pulled me over for making an illegal left-hand turn. And I had Ohio license plates on my car. And he started to search my car. And he opened my toolbox, and I had a buck knife. You know what a buck knife is, a lock blade knife?
Right.
Well, apparently he didn't know what it was. And he opened up my buck knife, which was in the toolbox. It wasn't in my pocket, wasn't anywhere where I could get to it. It was way in the back of my station wagon.
Uh-huh.
And he was squeezing the handle. And I made the comment to him, I said, "Be very careful, that's real sharp." Just about the time he triggered the lock on it, and it closed on his hand, and he yanked his hand out.
Oh, my gosh.
I didn't do anything, but I ended up in jail as a result of it.
So you got out.
Yeah, the Navy sent the guy from the Navy recruiting station. You know, you see these 1-800-NAVY recruiting things? That happened to be right there in Macon, Georgia. The guy that was in charge of that came and got me out of jail. I think I was in there for 2 days. He would bring me Burger King a couple times a day, but it was Christmas time, and my mother's family was up in Ohio for Christmas, and it was the big joke that Mike was on his way home for Christmas and got thrown in jail somewhere again. Because, of course, I'd had several DUIs.
So your reputation really preceded you there.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Can you kind of fast forward us into the years leading up to when you got sober and what your life looked like during those years? I mean, I know you've got kids. I know you got were they from the second or third marriage?
That was from the second marriage. Had 3 kids in fairly quick succession. We were married for just over 9 years when she said, "I've had enough of this," because I thought I was doing a good job being a father and a husband, but I'd disappear at 11 o'clock at night and show up at 3 o'clock in the morning drunk. And so I left Ohio after the divorce.
And she kept the kids?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Back then in the late 90s, it was almost automatic that the woman was going to get the children. There was no such thing as joint custody or anything like that. So my attorney suggested to me that he said, your kids are going to hate you if they don't hate you already. He goes, you might as well start your life over somewhere. So that's what I did. I came down here and I said, well, I'm going to start over. And so I started working down here. And I worked for a couple companies doing air conditioning work. Ultimately ended up working for myself and subcontracting out to some of the bigger air conditioning companies down here. I was doing okay. I wasn't paying any taxes. I was just drinking and working and having wrecks and getting DUIs. Ultimately, I got to the point where I wasn't employable anymore. I drank all the time. And I don't think I drew a sober breath for about 2 years. And I didn't actually end up homeless until like 1993. And my family didn't know. My mother lived here. My brother lived here, and nobody knew where I was. My mother finally got word that I was having a hard time. And she was the one that suggested that I go to the VA hospital. She didn't think I was an alcoholic. She thought I was having a mental breakdown because of the breakup of the marriage and the kids and all that. So I went to the VA, and the VA are the ones that right away said, you need to get sober.
Did you have any inkling prior to that experience at the VA that made you think maybe you were an alcoholic?
Oh, I knew I was.
When did you first really notice that?
When I was a junior in high school.
Okay.
People told me I was an alcoholic back then, friends.
Yeah.
They said, you got a problem.
You just never took it to heart.
No, I knew I had a problem. I didn't know there was any solution to it. You know, we grew up in a time when cowboys walked in and drank whiskey like nothing.
Uh-huh.
It was manly to drink alcohol and just take care of your own problems. And, you know, I was a manly kind of man.
Were you ready when you got to the VA?
No,
So you weren't ready to stop.
I wasn't ready to stop. I thought maybe I could dry out, and I thought maybe I could assemble some kind of life. I didn't know how because I was starting from scratch. But I had built up lives before and torn them down around myself several times. So I thought, well, I can do this again, and this time it'll be different. This time I won't tear it down around my ears.
Alcoholic's famous last words, right?
Yep. Went to a halfway house, spent 9 months there. The very day I got out of the halfway house, I went straight to Speck's Liquor and bought a bottle of whiskey and got a cheap hotel room on North Shepherd.
Were you sober during the months you were at the sober house? Mm-hmm. You were.
I was sober for 9 months, and George was my sponsor. And George told me several times, you need to work the steps. Yeah, I'll get to it, you know. He'd give me reading assignments and this and that, and we'd talk about it, but I'd never.
So you never really paid heed to anything that you were finding out about the program or yourself?
No, I treated it like it was boot camp. I treated it like it was just some kind of exercise that I needed to do, dry out, and I'd be okay. Left the halfway house. 30 days I was back in the county jail. And this time they let me out and I went straight to the VA hospital. Actually, it was a little bit of stop in between, but I ended up at the VA hospital covered in someone else's blood. And somebody had suggested, go to the VA hospital and tell them you're going to kill yourself and they'll take you in. And I went there and I tried that. And then they discovered the blood wasn't mine. And they said, you're not going to kill yourself. You just kept somebody else from killing you. You know, if you were to kill yourself, you'd have just let them do it. And they kicked me out of the hospital. And I walked around the corner from the VA hospital and I was sitting in a Metro bus stop. And I got on my knees and I said, God, literally got on my knees in the bus stop. It was like 1:30 in the morning. I said, God, I can't do this anymore. And right then a Houston cop car pulled up. Not really what I had in mind, but the Houston cop checked me out, and of course my license suspended long ago, so I didn't have a driver's license, anything. But he asked me my name and gave it to him. He ran me, said, oh, you don't have any wants or warrants, and he took me to a place called Stand Down Home for Veterans. A guy named Brother Bob, and I came in there, and at the time I'd probably been homeless for about 6 months. I mean, literally homeless. You know, with the guys down in front of the King George Hotel downtown. And he got me set up with a bedroom and, you know, the next day got me some clean clothes. And he sat down with me and he said, you know, Mike, he goes, he gave me a piece of paper and he says, I want you to start a gratitude list. And he says, I want you to write, the first thing I want you to write on is I got 2 shoes that match. Because I didn't when I walked in there. I had 1 brown shoe and 1 black shoe.
So all these years I've been listening to you talk about coming in off of the streets. I think a black garbage bag factored into it. Was that where all your possessions were?
Actually, I didn't have any at that point. I didn't have any possessions at that point. Okay. I had the clothes on my back. I ended up spending maybe a week, maybe 5 days in the Stand Down Home for Veterans before they got them to accept me back into the VA hospital program. And even they had quit having their inpatient, so they put me up in a hotel up off of Jensen that was a sober house. And I lived there. It was an old Holiday Inn hotel, and I lived there for 30 days they'd send a van every day to the hotel up off of Jensen, and it would take me to the VA hospital, and I'd go there for classes and have to piss in a cup for them. And, you know, once I had 30 days sober, because you had to have 30 days sober to get back into the halfway house up off of Shepherd. And so I got back in there. And I remember calling George from the VA hospital the second time. And he said, what are you going to do different? What's different from now?
Yeah, the standard question.
And I said, George, I don't know. He goes, well, maybe you got a chance. If you've run out of answers and you're ready to take some instruction, then maybe you're ready. And there was a counselor there at the VA hospital that told me, he said, you know, Mike, he goes, you're not a stupid person. He goes, I know you can read this book and you can rattle stuff off and make everybody think you're okay. He goes, but if you would just shut up and do what you're asked to do and allow sobriety to happen to you, you don't have to work very hard for it. You just have to not drink and do what you're asked, and you'll be fine. You'll have sobriety will happen for you, and you'll be amazed. And I must have listened to it because I can still remember that conversation.
So was that a turning point for you?
It was. It was. I think the real turning point was once I got back into the halfway house, and George and I worked through the first 2 steps, and we got to step 3. Mm-hmm. That glass chapel on Woodway is where I chose. He wanted me to choose a place to do my 3rd step that wouldn't go away. He says, I want you doing it here at the halfway house because this halfway house may not be here forever. And it's not anymore. So I chose the glass chapel there on Woodway. And we did my 3rd step, and he asked me that night, he said, do you think I'm sober? And I said, well, of course I think you're sober. He says, do you think I was as bad as you? I said, you might have been a little worse than me. He says, well, if you believe it can work, because I still wasn't convinced that this would work. I just didn't believe. I didn't have faith that this could change my life, that this could work for me. And he said, well, if it works for me, if it's worked for me, it can work for you. He goes, if you would just put half the effort into doing this that you put into getting drugs and alcohol, I guarantee you. He goes, he used to say that he was in the How It Works. He said he would change rarely to never. Never have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Because he said, everybody I know that's worked the steps has gotten sober and stayed sober.
You know, when I think about the way that Bill Wilson wrote that, my guess is that in 1939 when he was writing it, to be that categorical about something working or not working rarely gives him a little bit of wiggle room, because otherwise he could get indicted somewhere along the way for the one guy who got drunk who claims to have done everything on the path.
Yeah. But he handed me a legal pad and a couple number 2 pencils. He dropped me off at that job at the fiberglass fabrication plant. And over the next 8 hours, I wrote my 4th step. I filled that legal pad. It took us 13 hours to do my 5th step. And God bless him for sitting there for 13 hours with me while I went through that.
So you did your 4th step, you did your 5th step with George. Uh-huh. What was it like working the rest of them before you could say you'd completed the 12th step?
Gosh. Of course, it did the 6th and 7th. And then he had me sit down and write an 8th step amends list. And we sat down with each one of those on that list and decided whether it was somebody I needed to go back to or somebody that, I just needed to pray about. Usually sponsors say, oh, that woman. No, you don't need to go back to her. Nope. There were 2 he left on my list. I was really skeptical because one of them was a woman that I had slept with. And then I'd ended up being best man in her wedding. While I was dancing with her, her husband worked offshore on oil rigs. And while I was dancing with her at the reception, she said, you come and see me. And I thought, why would George want me to go back and make an amends to this woman? And of course, I didn't know where she was at. I thought, oh, I'll never see this woman again, so I don't need to worry about that. Just put that out of my mind. Of course, I get on a metro bus, and she's right there. I end up sitting next to her, making an amends, and she's like, oh, gosh, my husband needs this he went to the men's center and this and that. And
wow.
Yeah, it was funny. But George sat down with each one of those and took an index card, and we wrote exactly what I was supposed to say in each of those amends.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. He said, I don't want you deviating from this. My mother was the first one I made an amends with. And
How did that go?
that was really rough because my mother still didn't believe I was an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And she thought Alcoholics Anonymous was a scam. She was glad I was sober, but she thought it was a cult. And I said, well, Mom, they're not asking me. I don't have anything. I don't have any possessions to give them. They're not asking me to work for them or anything. They're just asking me to be sober. I said, shoot, if I get up at the right time to go to the bathroom during a meeting, I don't even have to put $1 in the basket.
Yeah.
But it was good. We went to lunch after that. As a matter of fact, it shook her up something fierce to the point where she drove her car into a ditch right in front of the halfway house. And the guys from the halfway house came out and picked her car up and set it back on the road. But she was happy, and eventually, and I was actually with her when she passed, or right before she passed. We had some experiences. I mean, she had a stroke. She was laying in the hospital after having her stroke, and there was a shortage of nurses at the time. And my brother had asked me to go down and stay with her for a while in the hospital, and I was living in an SRO downtown, so I took the bus down there, and I'm sitting there with her, and she had to go to the bathroom. And the nurses wouldn't come. And I said, okay, Mom, let's pray. So we prayed. I picked her up out of bed, and took her in the bathroom, and she did her thing, and I had to clean her afterwards. And it was a real moment for a mother and son. We both wept. I remember the next day my brother said, he goes, oh, well, I'm going to come down there and take over from you. I said, Tim, why don't you have your wife come down? Why don't you have Carol come down? Mm-hmm. I can do it. I said, and I didn't really want to tell him, but eventually I had to tell him what happened. And he says, oh, yeah, you're right. Let me send my wife down. And then she had an issue a few months later and had to have a minor abdominal surgery. And I prayed with her right before she went in on that. And she had told me outside the surgical suite that she didn't feel she was going to survive. And I said, Mom, they do this surgery all the time. You're going to be fine. I'm going to be here when you come out. Everything will be okay. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, Mike, you got to promise me, if I don't make it out of this surgery, that within 6 months you're going to straighten things out with those kids. Because I hadn't been paying child support.
And you were sober how long at this time?
Probably about 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, you got to promise me. And I said, Mom, if it'll make you feel better, okay. Within 6 months, I'll make contact and I'll start straightening things out. And damn if she didn't die during that surgery. I couldn't even go to her burial. She was buried back in Ohio because she'd bought a mausoleum for my father when he passed away. It was, had room enough for two. And I couldn't go because when I wanted to show up 7.5 years after, having gotten divorced and abandoned my kids and my ex-wife. So I stayed here and wrote a letter to my ex-wife asking her permission to call her. That's what I did, He took the letter up there with him and gave it to her, and I ended up calling her and starting the process. And I remember I was coming to this meeting here, and there were a lot of attorneys that came up and gave me their phone numbers thinking for sure I was going to end up in jail for non-payment. And that's not what happened.
I remember that. And I also remember you kept that commitment. You went up there.
It was within that 6 months, I believe. Made my verbal amends and asked her what she wanted me to do. And she said, I want you to pay the money that you owe us. and I want you to pay back the money from their savings accounts that I've had to use to support them while you've been gone. So I did that. It was by the time my oldest was just getting ready to turn 16 at the time, because the first thing he asked me to do was to pay for a driver's ed course for him. Because at that time they didn't do them in schools anymore. You had to go to a private. So I said, yeah, I can do that. And by the time he was 18, by the time he was emancipated, I had paid off the back child support that I owed. I've had different people tell me that I'm in the minority, that most guys that are paying, but I had to put all that out of my head. I had this obligation.
How did the amends go with the children?
Not well.
In what way?
Well, we had relationship, they weren't disrespectful to me in any way. I can't ever say that. They went on vacations with me once or twice. I took them whitewater rafting in West Virginia. But I could tell it was always kind of a strained, because I had abandoned them.
Yeah.
Abandoned them at a critical time in their lives, when they were adolescents. It went along okay for a while. My current wife, who I've been married to for 23 years, is my third marriage. And she loves the kids. And they have kids now. We have grandkids. My oldest and my middle one don't want any contact at all. My middle one has literally come out and said, don't ever call me again. My oldest, his battery is always dying on his phone every time I called, so I haven't called in a long time, over 10 years. I know one time I had an opportunity to do a meditation one time with some Buddhist monks. One of them come up to me after the meditation was over, and he says, are you okay? I said, yeah, why? He says, well, you got a tear rolling down your cheek. And I said, oh, I was probably just thinking about my kids. He says, why don't you tell me about it? And I told him, I said, I've been kind of deleted from their lives, I said, I've been canceled. And I said, it's hurtful, I told him a little bit of my story about how I had abandoned them and everything. And he says, let me ask you something. He goes, did you pray for them when they were born? I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did for each of them. He goes, what did you pray for? I said, well, I prayed that they'd be happy and healthy and successful. He goes, did all that stuff happen? I said, well, yeah. He goes, did you pray for them to love you back? And I said, well, no. He goes, well, you got what you prayed for. What are you whining about? He goes, there's plenty of these people in this world that don't know who you are or give a shit about you. He goes, you don't hate them. You don't love them. He goes, love isn't about getting it back. Love is about giving it away. So that helped me put it in perspective,
It sounds like a heck of a perspective builder for you.
Well, you have to do something. I'm not going to walk around miserable the rest of my life.
The reason I'm glad you're talking about this, Mike, the way you are, is because lots of people have the story that ends differently, where the amends are made and then the relationship in some way or another is restored. Like maybe one of the kids would be okay with you while the others weren't. And that, I guess that has happened with your one.
Hollywood endings. Yeah, my youngest texted me about a year ago telling me that he had been called up. He's a commander in the Navy. But he had left his active service and was in the Naval Reserve to do the rest of his 20 years and got called back up last October. He texted me in October telling me, yeah, I'm getting called back up. And I said, well, let me know what's going on and, as you can. And I haven't heard from him since. And that's okay. I'm so proud of my three sons. No matter what they're doing, I'm proud of them that they've gotten as far as they have, and I love them deeply. I'd like to say I've let go of the guilt, that I carried for a lot of years. I like when I'm in meetings and they're talking about the ninth step because I can share with people that some people aren't going to say, oh, it's okay. I'm so glad you're sober. Some people are going to say, give me my money and go away. Leave me alone. Don't ever call me again. and, and that's okay.
Yeah, I had one of those, and it's tough,
It is.
but it's necessary,
It
and it's
is.
just part of the process. I get the opportunity to see you in meetings. I get the opportunity to watch you interacting with other people, and I see that you are sought after by the men in the rooms, whether it's just to get to know you or to be of service with you. How do you work your AA program these days? Mike B's AA program circa 2025, what would it look like?
I get up in the morning. I've got 4 books that I read through. I pray. I can't say I do a meditation per se, but I read and I try and empty my mind of all the things that rattle around all our heads. I've started reading The Golden Key every day, and that's why I've started passing it out. I got so much out of it. It's worked so well for me. And George had actually not given me the golden key, but had actually told me when I first got sober, I was probably 3 weeks sober. And he told me, Mike, when you get frightened or angry or things are eating your lunch, because of course I still had all this stuff about the kids rattling around in my head. And he said, just ask God to remove it and move on. Just push it out of your head and ask God to remove it. And which is the golden key, basically. And probably the meeting where I get the most out of that I go there every Tuesday night at 6:30. And I get to talk to guys that are 2 weeks sober and give them my phone number. I've had a few call. Nobody seemed interested yet to start working the steps. But, I'm working on a few of them.
There's some guys who attempt to sponsor and it doesn't work out and they give up on it. What keeps you actively involved?
Cersei. I led a meeting down at Rock Hill Group down by Hobby Airport. The chairperson asked me, he said, what are you doing this afternoon? I said, no, nothing. He goes, you want to take a road trip with me? I said, sure. And so we drove up to a state park up in Round Rock. Took us a couple hours to get there. We got there about 5 o'clock in the evening, just in time for dinner. They had a bunch of barbecue. It was a roundup that weekend for a bunch of small groups in little towns all around that area that only have like one meeting a week. Had a nice little museum of early AA. So we get our plates of food and we walk out, and I see these picnic tables are all full. And I asked, is there any place where a drunk can get a seat? And this old man looked up at me and goes, just sit down here and shut up. Okay. Well, I was probably 10 months sober. And I sat down and he started peppering me with questions right away. How long you been sober? Well, about 10 months. He goes, are you sponsoring anybody yet? And I said, well, I give my phone number out. But very few people call, and when they do, all they want to do is piss and moan. Nobody seems to want to work the steps. He goes, we lay this kit of spiritual tools at their feet, and it's their job to pick it up. If they don't, fuck them, move on to the next one. He goes, when you've been sober as long as I have, you can start worrying about whether they stay sober or not. He goes, are you still sober? I said, well, yeah. Because it works then. He goes, just keep laying out that kit of spiritual tools for people. He goes, I guarantee you there's going to be guys that are going to want to work the steps. He goes, you'll work with more that don't than ones that do. He goes, you just keep plugging away and you'll stay sober. He goes, that's the selfish part of this program. We do this to keep ourselves sober. And if they've got any sense, they'll do the same to keep themselves sober. And then he got up and got a 50-year chip. He was the speaker that night. His name was Cersei. Oh, he knew Bill and Bob. And
I've heard that story. It's so amazing, and you remember every detail of it. It's beautiful.
I've met sponsees of his at the International in San Antonio.
That was a great convention.
Oh, it was.
When you look at your sobriety these days, Now that you're retired, what sort of things are you going to do with regard to AA?
You know, Howard, I don't know that I can set out a plan like that. Everything that has happened in sobriety to me, a lot of times I haven't seen it coming or even seen it when it was happening. I see it in the rearview mirror. You know, I see all the good things that have happened in the rear. It's other people around me that have seen the changes and say, oh, well, gosh, this happened to you. I mean, certainly buying homes and retiring from a job successfully after 23 years, or being married to the same woman and her, you know, telling me every day that she loves me and that I'm worthwhile in her life is a big accomplishment compared to what my life was before. You know, being able to successfully retire. You know, I didn't even think I'd live this long, let alone be able to afford to quit working. It's all because of this program. It's nothing that I could have done if I would have set my mind to it 30 years ago. I couldn't have accomplished what's happened. You know, this is all God's work, not my work.
And I've noticed that it's always great when you see God working in other people's lives, and I've seen Him working in your life. I want to thank you for going into as much detail as you did tonight about your story. My feeling is that somewhere, somehow, there are people who will listen to your story and identify with it. And it may be the reason why they choose to stay sober another day or get sober.
Well, I hope that I've said something that will be of use to someone.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. I feel very strongly about that. And I really cherish the fact that you and I have been so close for so long. Your birthday on the 30th and my birthday on the 1st of January means that we're almost always getting the chip around the same time at the same meeting. And that's been just having somebody to share my birthday with for, you know, the better part of 30 years is just remarkable.
Thank you. There have been some great guys that have taught me some good lessons in this room, you included. But I don't know whether you were here one time when I was in here. I was probably 3 years sober, and I'd gotten everything straightened out with the IRS. And I was headed out the room, and old Jerry, he walking out behind me, he says, you know, Mike, some of us have been paying our taxes all along.
He's a wise guy. He's a wise guy. Thanks so much for doing the AA Recovery Interviews podcast with me this evening.
Thank you.
Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. I want to thank my guest, Mike V., for sharing his story, and thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you do a little service work by spreading the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. AA Recovery Interviews is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. Or visit our website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments, suggestions, or questions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and YouTube Music. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.